right, so last week we began a new series together that I introduced to you, a series that we're just calling Be Love. And it's actually, as I told you last week, a continuation of a conversation we began together last spring in our Spring Monday series, a series that we called Be Strong. And I told you last week, both of these series, Be Strong and Be Love, were both inspired by words that we find from an early church leader, a guy by the name of Paul, almost 2,000 years ago. And Paul, as I told you last week, kind of recap for you with last week, when he started out, enemy of the church. He did not like Jesus or his followers. He thought they were heretical. He thought they were a danger. And he tried to stomp it all out. And Jesus got a hold of his life and revealed himself to Paul. And Paul went from being an enemy of the church to one of its greatest heroes. And Paul committed his life as he surrendered his life to Jesus, to doing whatever it took to tell everyone he possibly could about Jesus. And in fact, he even went on to plant new churches in cities and towns all around the known world. And he stayed in touch with those, and many of the churches that he helped start, he wrote letters to. And some of those letters that he wrote to these churches, we have. It makes up part of what we have in our Bibles today. And so we've been looking at some words that Paul, this character that I just told you about there, that he wrote to a church that he helped start in the ancient city of Corinth. And Corinth is in modern-day Greece. It was an ancient Roman city. It had all the sights and sounds and sins of Roman cities back then. And Paul started a church there, and he knew that this church was loaded with potential. So much potential, so many God-given abilities and gifts and things that God wanted to do for them. But Paul also knew that they were never going to reach that potential unless they addressed some of the problems, the brokenness, the dysfunction that they had in their church community. And so he addressed a whole variety of things in a letter that we have in our Bible that we call 1 Corinthians. And at the end of this letter, he kind of summarized his instructions and recommendations to them with 5 short commands that we find in 1 Corinthians 16, verses 13 and 14. We have it up here on the screen. We've been talking about this together, where he said these 5 things. He said, I want you to be on guard. I want you to stand firm in the faith. I want to challenge you to be courageous, or we said it literally means to act like men, to man up and be manly. He says, I want you to be strong, which we talked about last spring. And then he gave this last command here, the one that we're going to be looking at over the course of this series together, where Paul said to do everything with love. And as I shared with you, we're kind of focusing, we spent some time last spring talking about that 4th command to be strong. We're spending time in this series talking about this last command here, to do everything with love, or we've just titled it to be love. And as I told you last week, I think one of the things that we have to do to live this out, to do what Paul's challenged us to do here, is we have to actually get to know what love is and what it looks like and what it's all about. And in fact, kind of a series big idea that I gave you last week that you have there just listed at the top of your notes is this idea that I've got up here on the screen. The better we get to know love, what it is, what it looks like, what it's all about, I think the better we're able to show love. And so to do what Paul talked about here, to do everything with love, to show love, to be love, I think one of the things that helps us with that is to better get to know what love actually is. And so in these weeks together, this is what we're kind of setting out to do. We're talking about love, not as Hollywood defines it, not as our world defines it for us, but actually how God has defined it and how one of his servants, one of the leaders in the church, a guy by the name of Paul, how he's described it for us as well. And so I shared with you last week, there are a couple things we're going to lean into to help us get to know love better in order to get to show love better. We're going to be looking at an explanation of love that God's given to us, actually in this same letter that we've been looking at in 1 Corinthians, as well as the example of love that God has given to us as well, the ways that God has relentlessly loved each one of us, and in fact, the whole world over and over and over again. And so we're looking at these couple things together as it relates to the explanation of love that God's given to us. We're going to start to dive into that a little bit more tonight. And as I said, it's actually in this same letter we've been looking at together in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. It's just a few chapters before those commands that I just read for you in chapter 16. Paul gives us what often is referred to as the great love chapter. And he gives us a great description. He gives us actually 15 different kind of angles and varieties and descriptions of what love is, to kind of present us with almost like a puzzle, as I said to you last week, that when we piece it all together, it paints this thorough, holistic picture for us of what love is. And so that's what we're unpacking together. And as I pointed out to you last week when I introduced this, I said a few things about this kind of love that Paul's talking about, that God has given to us in Paul's explanation of love. We said it's a very unique kind of love. It's referred to as agape love. Can you all say agape? Agape. We had you learn a few Greek words with that last week. This is the word. Remember, Paul wasn't limited by language the way that we are in our day. We have one word for love. Paul had multiple words to choose from, and when he was describing the kind of love that we needed to do everything with, he used this word, the word agape. And I tried to unpack that a little bit with you last week. I explained to you that this kind of love, agape love, is one that's defined by God and not by us. And the reason for that, we actually read by another place in the Bible, one of Jesus' closest followers, a guy by the name of John, he described God this way. He said, God is love. And the word he used here is the word agape. In other words, God is agape. If we're going to live like that, if we're going to be that to others, we need to look no further than God himself, because he's the one who defines it for us. He's the one who sets the bar and sets the standard and shows us what this kind of love is like. So not only does God define it and not us, a couple other things that we talked about is that this kind of love is not based on emotions or feelings, but on choices and commitment. And we said this, that for God, or for Jesus to command us to love others, and not only to love others, but to even love our enemies, implies for us that he's not talking about an emotion or feeling, because I told you last week, you can't command a feeling. And so when we talk about love in this series, we're not talking about touchy-feely, we're not talking about warm, gushy, we're talking about something much deeper than that. We're talking about our character, we're talking about our commitment to demonstrate and to show love to others through our actions and our words and our attitudes, even when we don't feel like it. It's a matter of our choices. It's also something I said last week, that it's a sacrificial kind of love. It's unconditional. It's not based on whether other people deserve it or have earned it. It's not a fair trade kind of love, but it's something we give of ourselves. It costs us something. And at its heart, it's centered around the idea of us being selfless. And then lastly, I pointed out for you last week a thought or an idea that I hope kind of just sticks with us and lingers among us here over the next few weeks together. We talked about this fact that love, agape, is a choice. And then one of the reasons I think it's such a powerful and profound topic for us as men to grapple with together is that this love is a choice, and only the strongest choose it. The things that we're going to talk about together, the descriptions of love that Paul gave us, as we talk about those, we're going to be reminded again that these are not easy things. They're sacrificial. They cost us something. They're difficult. They involve us surrendering, dying to ourselves, being selfless. And so only the strongest will choose it. And then I also told you at the end last week that not only that, but only Jesus can help us to choose it. So even if you're not a follower of Jesus in the room here tonight over the course of this series, I think you're going to find a lot of this very helpful and practical, but I think you'll also find that most of us are not going to be very good at doing the things that we're going to talk about together apart from him. Apart from Jesus being at work in our lives, because nobody has ever loved better in the ways that we're going to be talking about it together than Jesus. And we need him as both our kind of illustration of how to do it, but also our inspiration for why we do this. And so this is what we're going to talk about together and kind of walk through. If you have a Bible with you, I invite you to open that up to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. If you don't have a Bible, we'll have the verses up here. But I encourage that as kind of a habit for you. If you have a Bible or you have a Bible on your phone or mobile device, bring that with you. Open it up when we talk about this together. And what I want to talk about with you tonight are the first of few of these descriptions that Paul gives to us here. As I said, he kind of paints a picture for us. He gives us a puzzle. And I want to look at with you the first of these kind of puzzle pieces that we find here in this passage. Let me read the whole passage for you, and then we'll get into the ones that we're going to be talking about together tonight. Here's what he says in 1 Corinthians 13, starting in verse 4. Paul says, love, agape, is patient, and love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking. We said that last week. At the heart of all this description is the idea that this kind of love is selfless. It's not self-seeking. He goes on, he says, it's not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. This kind of love, the word here, agape, never fails. Again, an incredible description. Sometimes we almost get used to it in our culture. We hear it read at weddings, and it sounds like a Hallmark card and all kinds of stuff, but there's so much depth. And again, all of these things are choices, and only the strongest will choose them. So let's talk about these first three tonight. And again, on the notes that I gave you, you can look there and kind of follow along there as we just read. The first description for love that Paul gives us here is just the idea that love is patient. And I think this is such a great one for him to start out with, because I don't know if you're like me here tonight and you're honest enough to admit it and aware of yourself enough to recognize that most of us aren't very good at this most of the time. I mean, some of us have a disposition, a kind of personality. We're wired in a more laid back way, and perhaps we are. But for many of us, it's so appropriate to start here. Because when we talk about love, many of us struggle with this very thing, the fact that love is patient. The word that Paul used here is actually kind of a mashup word, like a compound word, where he took one word that meant something and another word that meant something, kind of smashed it up together. And that word that Paul used here that we've translated as patient is a word that literally means long suffering. To be patient, from Paul's mentality, means to be long suffering. And he wasn't talking so much about our circumstances or situations, those moments where like you're waiting in a long line at the grocery store, or you're waiting in traffic or something like that. He's not so much talking about being patient with those things, but primarily talking about being patient with people. Especially the difficult people in your life, the people that anger you, the people that frustrate you, the people that irritate you, the people that aggravate you. Any of you have any of those kinds of people in your life, right? All of us have someone that probably falls into that category. And what Paul's saying is for us to love those people, to choose love in that way, is to be long suffering with them. I want to illustrate this a different way, in a way that has been actually kind of wrecking me lately in my own life, with my kids especially, in my family, and in different settings that I find myself in. Not only does this word literally mean to be long suffering, but I want to give you kind of a different description that unpacks that in a different way, or illustrates that in a different way. And I want to introduce that to you just with an image that we have up here on the screen. You see this? This is a pot of water boiling. And I want you just to think about that for a moment. I want you to imagine that. Perhaps you've been at home, if you do any cooking, or you've just been around that. We boil water at times to cook pasta, or to hard boil an egg, or whatever it might be. And you've sat over perhaps a pot kind of waiting for it and watching it boil. And one of the reasons I want to share that with you tonight is that I think this idea of being long suffering, or this idea of being patient, choosing to be patient as an expression of love to others, essentially implies this: it means slow to boil. And here's what I mean by that. At home on our stove, we got a new stove a couple years ago when we moved into our new house, and the one that we have now recognized that people don't want to wait a long time for their water to boil, right? So we have 4 different kind of stove tops on top there, or different burners. 2 of them are just regular burners, and then we have 2 burners that are quick boil burners, right? And we love to use those because they help to get the water heated up quick. They heat things up quickly. They get things bubbling quickly. They try to get the boil going quickly so we don't have to waste time with that. They're quick to boil. And as I think about that in my own life, again, in some of my relationships, some of the people, some of the difficult people that I have to interact with at times, sometimes I'm exactly like the quick boil burner, right? And instead of being long suffering, I'm actually very quick to turn the heat up on things. I'm very quick to get bubbling and get irritated and agitated in some way. And I think what Paul is reminding us in this passage, that to love, to choose love with other people around us, is to choose to be long-suffering, to choose to be slow to boil. And I want you to think about that for a moment. I want you just to give some space for a moment to think about the people in your life, some of the relationships in your life. I want you to think about your spouse, if you're married, or your significant other. I want you to think about your kids. I want you to think about family or friends or coworkers or supervisors. I want you to think about neighbors, people in your neighborhood, the customer service rep you have to deal with, the server at the restaurant you go to, whoever it might be. I want you to think about some of those people and some of those situations. And I want you just to imagine yourself and ask yourself the question: are you slow to boil? Again, I can tell you this. I've been preparing to talk about this with all of you over the last few weeks. This is one of the descriptions of love that God has just been confronting me with, especially with my kids. Any of you who are dads, I'm sure you can relate. Probably we all relate differently to different extents and different levels, but kids have a way of just making you quick to boil, right? And when I go home, we've got great kids at home, just totally blessed by our kids. But a couple of our kids, particularly our 2 boys who are about the same age, I mean, they're at an age right now where all they do is fight each other. I feel like all I do when I'm home is referee, and I'm like a police officer trying to keep them from doing things I've told them 1,000 times not to do. I'm trying to keep them from breaking things that don't need to be replaced or fixed unless you break them and do things I told you not to do with them, or they make a mess of things that I have to come home after a long work day and I got to deal with or clean up or kind of adjust or mess with in some way. And some of you, again, if you're dads, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And there have been moments in the midst of that where, man, they're driving me crazy, and I'm like on the quick boil burner. And God confronts me in those moments. He says, wait a minute, you want to be love? You need to be slow to boil. You need to choose to be patient. In those moments, God reminds me, if we take a moment to step back and pause and just reflect on the ways that he's loved me, God is a good heavenly Father. In many ways, one of the interesting things about being a dad is as you interact with your kids, if you're aware enough to recognize it, you realize that so many of the things that they do that can drive you insane are the same things we do to God as a heavenly Father, the ways that we continue to do the things he's told us not to do, the things that he's continuing to teach us and to reveal to us and impress on us in our lives, and we continue to fail to learn what he's trying to teach us over and over again. The things that drive me nuts with them, I do all the time, and yet God has chosen to be patient with me and with you. He's been long-suffering. He's been slow to boil. And then Jesus looks at us and he says, you want to follow me? Come. Let me show you a better way. Let me show you a new way, a way of love. Let me show you how to be loved, to do everything with love. And one of the ways that we do that is to choose to be patient with those around us, to choose to be slow to boil. Second description that he gives us, we continue on in the passage there, is not only the idea of love is patient, but then he goes on and he talks about this idea that love is kind. The word that he uses here that's translated kind is an interesting word. It's only found here in the entire Bible. Some scholars actually believe that Paul may have even kind of made this word up himself for this very reason and kind of mashed it up together to try to communicate a particular idea. And to give you kind of a sentence that summarizes what I think this word means for us as we're talking about it tonight, I think this idea of being kind to others as an expression of love to them is this: it involves being both good to people and also good for people. What I mean by that is that in the ways that we treat people, is in the things that we do for people, and the things that and the kind of attitudes that we have to them, that we're both pleasant with them and also practical for them, that there's a benefit, that what we're doing is beneficial to them, but it's also enjoyable to them. And as I thought about that, there was a phrase that came to mind that I think about sometimes when it comes to food that perhaps you've heard of or you've been familiar with before, but this idea of being both delicious and nutritious, right? And maybe you heard the phrase or you're familiar with that. We know that many times one of the curses of food is that often the best tasting food is the worst food for us, right? I mean, almost everything that tastes good is awful for you, and everything that's so good for you usually doesn't taste that good to you unless you're strange or weird and you kind of like that kind of stuff. Many times the way it works is something is either delicious or nutritious, but rarely do you find something that's both delicious and nutritious. And yet I think this idea here that we're talking about, that we see sometimes, often rarely with food, is exactly what Paul's talking about here when it comes to being kind to others. It's both good for people and also good to people, both delicious and nutritious. When I thought about that idea, I was thinking about something a few years ago that just blew my mind. It's probably actually not a very good illustration, except at the time it felt like a good one for me. And that was with when I first realized that something like Nutella could also be not only good to taste, but also some nutritional value, they tell you. Now, most people would tell me that's actually not the case at all. But at the time when I found out that some people actually thought this was a healthy alternative to things, it blew my mind. I thought, wait a minute, here's something that's both delicious and nutritious. All the doctors in the room or anyone that knows their weight and things knows that this is probably as nutritious as a candy bar, but they sold me on it at one point when they talked about hazelnuts and how it was good for you and all that kind of stuff. And but this is kind of the idea that I think Paul's trying to talk about here when it comes to being kind as an expression of love. When I thought about this, I thought about a lady I met several years ago that was kind of only half of this. She was one of these things, but not both of these things. And I think it illustrates, again, what it means for us to be kind as an expression of love. Years ago, when I was in college, I worked as a bank teller to kind of make my way through college. And I worked at the drive-thru. And every Monday morning, I would have this same old lady that would come through my drive-thru. She was the secretary from the church in the small community that I was working at this bank in. And she was an interesting lady. I kind of pegged her quickly. I stereotyped her very quickly as I interacted with her over the course of a few weeks. She was one of those ladies that was probably very faithful, probably always very dependable, did the things that she needed to do, probably very particular and precise and accurate, and probably did a lot of good things for people. But she was the grumpiest old lady I've ever met in my life. She came through, she was snotty and upset with me. I didn't even do anything. I think she just didn't like me or something. But she would come through with her big deposit slip written out for the church that she was from and be just the grumpiest old lady that you've ever seen in your life. And I remember at that moment thinking to myself, I was in college at the time, preparing to someday hopefully be a pastor and be in a church. And I remember thinking to myself, man, I don't ever want to be that kind of Christian. And I hope that in any church that I'm ever a part of, that I'm not working with a bunch of people that are that way, that are busy doing a lot of good things for people, checking a lot of boxes, probably doing a lot of good things for people. Very practical person, dependable person, reliable person, but not necessarily always very good to people in the way that she treated them and interacted with them. She was nutritious, but not delicious, right? And I think what Paul's talking here, the idea that he's communicating with the idea that love is kind, really involves both. And just like we did with patience, I think the challenge is for us to wrestle with that and think about our lives and think about our relationships and the people you interact with. Again, your spouse, someone you're dating, your kids, your family, your friends, your neighbors, coworkers, supervisor, whoever it might be, the people you interact with them, would they look at you and think to themselves, they may not use these words, but would they think to themselves, man, they're both nutritious and delicious. That was both good for me and also good to me. And I think if they can, we're doing something right. And I think if they can't, then perhaps we're missing some of what it means for us to be love when an expression of love is to be kind. The third thing I want to talk to you about tonight then is not only that love is patient and love is kind, but I want to talk about this third description he gave, that love does not envy. And the word envy here is a word, it's an interesting one as well. It was translated from the Greek word Paul used, the word zelao, which we get our English word zealous from that. And it involves this kind of intensity. You think of being very zealous. It's kind of this intense feeling, this many times a very negative feeling that you have towards someone else who has something that you want or that they have something that you feel like you can't get. And kind of like what I did with the idea of kindness, I want to give you a phrase I've been thinking about with this that I hope will be helpful for you in understanding what I think it means for us to be envious, what we don't want to be. If we want to be love, we don't want to do this. But here's what I think this whole idea of being envious looks like and is all about for us. I think to have envy involves wanting what other people have, but also it involves not wanting others to have what you want. Now, many of you are writing that down. Let me read that for you again. I want you just to think about those two phrases and the slightly different pictures that each of these paints. I think to envy somebody else involves perhaps wanting what other people have. But even more than that, I think it also involves not wanting others to have what you want. And here's what I mean by that. Obviously, we think of envy, if you've heard of the word before, if you've heard of the idea, you know it's okay, somebody has something and you want it and you're envious of what they have. They have something that you want. And that's pretty obvious. We kind of understand that. But there's another side to this too that I think can be even more subtle and even more dangerous and a little sneakier in our lives, but just as destructive. And it's when somebody else gets something that you want, suddenly you're kind of resenting them for having. It's not that you just want what they have, but you don't want them to have what you want. Are you with me? And you see this at different times. When you think about people in your life, you think about a family member that gets a new job at work, or they move into a new house, or a friend of yours, they get a new car, or they accomplish some great accomplishment, or some friend, some hobby they're working on, they achieve something great. Many times they're things that you didn't even know you wanted, or you weren't even setting out to achieve for yourself, but when somebody else does it, suddenly it's not just wanting what somebody else has, but you don't want them to have something that perhaps you want. And there's this resentment, this bitterness, almost this kind of this tension that gets created because of other people having things you want, or you just not wanting them to have something that you wanted to have for yourself. And many of us live in that. And as I thought about that, I was kind of wrestling with that myself because I think this is so easy for us as guys in the world that we live in and the competitive culture that many of us find ourselves in at times. This can be a tough one. As I thought about this in my own life, again, I thought about a lot of different examples where I've wrestled with this at times. Sometimes you hear good news for somebody else that has almost nothing to do with you, and it bothers you. And that is envy. I remember when I was a kid, I was in middle school at the time, but this really went on all throughout high school. I had a good friend of mine. He was one of the guys, he was an all-star athlete, good at every sport he tried, made every team, made the starting team of every team that he was on. Everybody was talking about him. Everyone was impressed by what he could do, and everybody celebrated all of his accomplishments and achievements except me, because I was envious. Not only did he have something I wanted, but I wanted to have that, but I was jealous. I was envious of him that he had something that I wanted for myself. And over the course of that time, there have been moments where people would celebrate with him, and I would always be the guy that was kind of playing the devil's advocate. I'd downplay it. Well, I mean, that's great that he did that, but I mean, you see, he's not very good at this over here. And in some way, that was kind of helping me feel better in a sick, twisted way for the envy I experienced for the things that he was experiencing. And again, I think if we're aware enough of our own lives, we probably can all recognize some of that. If we're honest enough to admit it, I think we can all acknowledge some of that. And I think what Paul would say to all of us with that is this: to love, to choose to love, is to choose something better and different than that. And instead of being bitter and resenting others for what they have or things that they have that you want to have, that we'd celebrate with them. I think to love them is choosing to kind of celebrate the good things that are happening in other people's lives, to celebrate the ways that they've accomplished, the things that they've achieved, the possessions they've acquired, that rather than kind of quietly or sometimes not so quietly harboring bitterness and resentment toward them for those things, that instead we would celebrate with them, because love does not envy. Now, hopefully, I've successfully stepped on all of our toes in some way tonight, because I think this is what God wants to do. He wants to show us a picture of what love is, but then he also wants to show us our own lives and have us look into a mirror and see some of the areas that we're settling for things that are not love, so that we can recognize those and lean into those together, and we can follow Jesus into a new and better way.